Of the 50 states in the U.S., the most recognizable of all would likely be Texas. It's the second biggest state, and it's a culture that seems to be formed almost separate from the United States. And this is all true because for 9 years, Texas was its own independent republic. Its creation from American settlers moving into Texas and soon its war against Mexico. Seeing how Texas has changed American history for a while, it seems interesting to ask, what if Texas never joined the U.S.? What if Texas stayed independent? I'm sure you all know this timeline takes place in a pretty tense era of American history, as the government was fought between the anti-slavery North and the pro-slave South. We will need to keep the people who were against Texas annexation to stay in power, that being the Whig Party. But first, we'll go off track by saying in the Texas election of 1844, the politician Edward Burleson defeats Anson Jones. Edward Burleson was one of a few politicians who wanted Texas to stay independent. But then we return to the U.S. for the U.S. election of 1844. In this election, Henry Clay was running for the Whig Party against James K. Polk, but the Whigs would apply the features that made them popular in New England around the country. So after convincing the states of Georgia, Virginia, and South Carolina would vote for the Whigs, this leads to Henry Clay winning the election and stopping any current advance to annex Texas. So later in the U.S. election of 1848, the Whigs would still need a win. Instead of Zachary Taylor being nominated in this timeline, it would be Henry Clay winning re-election. Since Zachary Taylor never becomes president, this means Millard Fillmore would never destroy the Whig Party, and Zachary Taylor would soon become the Whig Party nominee in 1852, and win then. Lastly, we would have the U.S. election of 1856, which introduced the anti-slavery Republican Party. This means that the election would be running between the Whigs, Democrats, and Republicans. But still, this election would end with the Republicans winning 4 years earlier than our own timeline. This leads to the South panicking, and likely tensions that would rise that would lead to an earlier civil war in this timeline. This conflict would leave Texas on its own and end the idea of a Texas annexation. Eventually, a feeling of Texan identity would develop as Texas looks to become a modern nation. The Texan Democratic Party would allow other Texan political parties to form. Policies in the government of Texas would include Texan nationalism, Texas identity, anti-nativism, and the continuation of slavery. Tensions with Mexico would affect the population as Mexico has problems with Texas. Not only would they not recognize them as independent, but Texas would claim its borders along the Rio Grande River, taking up a lot of Mexican territory. It's likely a militaristic culture would be spread in Texas, as well as fierce anti-Mexican sentiment. The young republic would also be on a quest for international recognition, specifically from powers like Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Texas was beginning to do this before they were annexed in our timeline, but in this timeline they would continue this further. But I believe their best bet would come with an ambitious Frenchman. Napoleon III was ambitious, wanted to follow his uncle's legacy. Napoleon III had many ideas that honestly deserve a video of his own. One of them included colonizing Mexico, so he would take advantage of Mexico's current state by officially recognizing the Republic of Texas and supporting its Rio Grande claims. Other nations here to Europe would soon follow suit, but France and Texas would together invade Mexico. With the chaos that would come from this, we would see Texas and France split Mexico, with the territories that America took in our timeline being given to Texas. California would also play a big part in this. Without California, the United States would likely be a weaker and smaller nation, with Texas deemed to become the new North American power instead of them. This would continue as Texan imperialists take power and influence others in the Caribbean and other parts of the continent. Slavery would end in Texas too, with France threatening to end their alliance if they didn't do that. It's likely as we enter the 20th century that World War I would spread to the Caribbean and North America. We'd see a front in North America during the First World War. But now I think I'll end this here, as I personally think that if Texas stayed independent, it could have unlocked some potential to become a real continental power. And that's where I'll leave it.